Eleanor Thompson's weathered hands froze on the auction paddle, her entire body going rigid as the auctioneer's voice cut through the humid Tennessee air. The three starving wolves huddled in their filthy cages weren't just any animals. One wore a faded blue collar she'd sewn with her own arthritic fingers 5 years ago. It wasn't possible. Tommy was dead. The crowd erupted in nervous laughter when the 72-year-old widow stood on shaking legs, her voice cracking like thunder across the stunned silence. "I'll take them all." Children pressed against their mothers' skirts while grown men stepped backward, their faces pale with disbelief. This was the crazy, grieving grandmother who still set a place at dinner for a ghost. But Eleanor saw what they couldn't: the faint letters T.E.T. carved into the leather, her grandson's initials worn smooth by desperate paws. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird fighting for freedom. If Tommy's collar was here, where was Tommy? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 5 years ago, Eleanor May Thompson had been a different woman entirely. At 67, she'd still been the backbone of Millbrook's volunteer fire department, the first person neighbors called when tragedy struck, and the grandmother who never missed a school play or baseball game. Her modest farmhouse on Willow Creek Road had been filled with the sound of running feet and Tommy's infectious laughter, echoing through rooms that now stood silent as a tomb. The accident had changed everything. One moment her 8-year-old grandson was building a fort in the woods behind her property, and the next, Sheriff Bob Wilson was standing on her porch with his hat in his hands and that look in his eyes that every parent and grandparent prays they'll never see. "Flash flood caught him down by Miller's Creek," he'd said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Current was too strong. We found his backpack caught on a branch 2 miles downstream. They never found his body." Eleanor had spent the first year searching every creek, every culvert, every inch of forest within a 50-mile radius. She'd hired private investigators with money she couldn't afford, plastered missing person flyers on every telephone pole from Nashville to Knoxville, and called the sheriff's office so many times they'd started screening her calls. When the insurance money ran out, she'd mortgaged the farm her late husband Henry had left her free and clear. Now, at 72, she lived alone in a house that felt more like a museum than a home. Tommy's bedroom remained exactly as he'd left it. Star Wars sheets still unmade from his last sleepover, homework assignments yellowing on his desk, a half-finished model airplane gathering dust on the windowsill. She still cooked for 2 out of habit, then scraped untouched portions into containers she'd forget in the refrigerator until they spoiled. The foreclosure notice had arrived exactly 30 days ago, typed on official bank letterhead in cold, impersonal font. $15,000. That was all that stood between her and homelessness, but it might as well have been $15 million. Her monthly Social Security check barely covered utilities and groceries, and the part-time job at Millbrook's only diner had ended when her arthritis made carrying heavy trays impossible. The townspeople of Millbrook had watched Eleanor's descent with a mixture of pity and uncomfortable distance. She'd gone from being the woman they called when they needed something done to the crazy, grieving grandmother who talked to empty air in the grocery store checkout line and left toys on a grave that held no body. But Eleanor didn't care what they thought anymore. She'd lost everything that mattered except the stubborn hope that somewhere, somehow, Tommy was still alive. The livestock auction at McGillicuddy's barn drew folks from 3 counties every second Saturday, but today felt different. Eleanor had driven her rusty pickup through the morning mist with $312 in her purse, every dollar she had left in the world, and no clear idea why she'd come. Maybe it was the restlessness that had been eating at her lately, or maybe it was just the desperate need to be around living things that didn't look at her with pity. The crowd was thicker than usual, buzzing with an energy that made her skin crawl. She'd spotted the strangers immediately, city men in expensive boots who didn't belong at a Tennessee livestock auction, their eyes cold and calculating as they surveyed the crowd like predators sizing up prey. Auctioneer Jake Collins worked through the usual offerings with practiced efficiency. Dairy cows, breeding bulls, farm equipment that had seen better decades. Eleanor found herself bidding on a broken hay rake she didn't need, just to feel like she was still capable of making decisions, still part of the living world. Then Collins gestured toward a covered trailer at the far end of the yard, and the atmosphere shifted like air before a tornado. "Now, folks, we come to some special items," Collins announced, his voice carrying an uncomfortable edge. "These next lots require experienced handlers. We're talking about dangerous animals here." A well-dressed man emerged from behind the trailer, and Eleanor felt ice form in her veins. She recognized the type from her nursing days, men who smiled while they hurt you, who spoke in gentle tones while their eyes calculated how much pain they could inflict before you broke completely. "Allow me to introduce Mr. Jeremiah Blackwood," Collins continued. "He's brought us some rare specimens from up in the mountains. Now, I want to be clear, these aren't pets, people. These are genuine timber wolves captured alive after considerable effort." The canvas coverings came off 3 heavy-duty cages, and Eleanor's world tilted off its axis. The wolves were dying. 2 adults and a juvenile, all reduced to skin and bone, their once magnificent coats matted with filth and dried blood. The adult male bore fresh whip marks across his shoulders. The female's left ear hung in tatters, infected and crawling with flies. But it was the young one that broke Eleanor's heart, barely more than a pup, lying motionless in the corner of his cage, ribs showing through fur that should have been silver gray and thick. Iron chains bound their legs with medieval cruelty, short enough to prevent them from standing fully or lying down comfortably. Dark stains on the cage floors told stories Eleanor didn't want to imagine. But what stopped her breath entirely was the collar around the young wolf's neck. Faded blue canvas with hand-stitched edges, the same collar she'd made for Ranger, Tommy's beloved mutt, 3 years before the flood. Her fingers found the smooth metal tags she'd sewn into that collar, and her heart nearly stopped. There, worn smooth but still legible, were the letters she'd carved herself. T.E.T. Thomas Edward Thompson. "As you can see," Blackwood called out in a voice like poisoned honey, "these are prime specimens. The male weighs close to 90 pounds, or did before we trimmed him down for transport. The female's got good bloodlines, and the pup shows promise if it survives the conditioning process." Conditioning. Eleanor's hands clenched into fists. She knew what that meant from her days treating domestic violence victims at the county hospital. Break their spirits first, then rebuild them as weapons. Several men in the crowd nodded approvingly. Eleanor recognized the type. Bored ranchers looking for new forms of entertainment, gamblers always seeking fresh action, and the kind of men who confused cruelty with strength. The bidding started at $50 for the lot. Eleanor watched in horror as the price climbed, knowing that whoever bought these broken animals would finish destroying what little remained of their souls. At $75, she found herself standing, her voice cutting through the crowd like a knife. $300! The auction yard fell silent except for the sound of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Every face turned toward the crazy old woman who'd just bid 4 times what anyone expected to pay. "Ma'am," Collins stammered, "you understand these are wild predators, not—" "I understand perfectly," Eleanor said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. $300 for all 3. Samuel Morrison, her nearest neighbor, pushed through the crowd with his face red as Georgia clay. "Eleanor Thompson, have you lost what's left of your mind? You bring those killers into our valley and every decent family here will lose livestock." But Eleanor was staring at the young wolf, at Tommy's collar around its neck, and all she could think was, if that collar was here, then maybe, just maybe, Tommy was somewhere out there, too, waiting for his grandmother to find him. The gavel fell with a sound like thunder, and Eleanor's last $300 bought her the first real hope she'd felt in 5 years. The journey back to Willow Creek Farm passed in tense silence, broken only by the creak of wagon wheels and the occasional whimper from the covered cages. Eleanor had borrowed Jake Morrison's livestock trailer, promising to return it by sundown, though she suspected after today's spectacle, Jake might never speak to her again. Dr. Sarah Mitchell was waiting when Eleanor pulled into her gravel driveway, having ridden out ahead to prepare. The young veterinarian took one look at the covered cages and shook her head with the weary expression of someone who'd seen too much animal cruelty in her short career. "Eleanor, please tell me you didn't do what half the county's already talking about on the party line." "I did what needed doing, Sarah." They carried the cages into the old dairy barn one at a time, and when Sarah pulled back the canvas coverings, her face went pale as morning mist. In the better light of the barn, the wolves' condition was even worse than Eleanor had realized. Open sores marked where the chains had rubbed their legs raw. Their ribs showed clearly through matted fur, and all three bore evidence of systematic abuse that made Eleanor's stomach turn. But it was the collar that held her attention. That faded blue canvas she'd stitched with her own hands during one of those endless evenings after Henry's funeral. When keeping busy was the only thing that kept her sane, she'd made it oversized, expecting Ranger to grow into it. Tommy had been so proud, telling everyone at school that his grandmother made the best dog collars in all of Tennessee. "The young one might not make it through the night," Sarah said after a quick examination, her voice heavy with professional resignation. "Severe dehydration, malnutrition, and what looks like internal injuries. The adults aren't much better off." Eleanor studied the carved bone whistle hanging from a peg near her workbench. Another memento from happier times, whittled by Henry during the long winter evenings when Tommy would sit between them, listening to stories about the old days. Henry had always said wolves and dogs spoke the same language if you knew how to listen. "What do you need to help them?" Sarah was already unpacking her bag with practiced efficiency. "Water first, but they're too weak to drink on their own. We'll need to force fluids, and that means getting close to animals that still have teeth." She glanced at the iron shackles with obvious distaste. "Those chains need to come off, but the moment we free them, they'll either try to run, which will kill them in their condition, or they'll try to fight, which amounts to the same thing." Eleanor made her decision with the same instinct that had guided her through 40 years of emergency nursing. She opened the gate to the young wolf's cage and stepped inside. The animal's eyes opened immediately, amber and intelligent despite his weakness. A low growl rumbled in his chest, but Eleanor saw something beyond the threat. Pain, yes, but also a desperate kind of courage that reminded her of the pediatric patients who'd fought so hard to live. "Easy, sweet boy," Eleanor murmured, slowly lowering herself to sit cross-legged just outside the wolf's reach. She pulled the bone whistle from her pocket and played a few soft notes. Not a melody, but the kind of low, communal sound she'd heard Henry make to calm, spooked horses. The wolf's ears pricked forward, and the growling stopped. "That's right," Eleanor continued, setting down a shallow bowl of water. "You remember those sounds, don't you? Your mom and daddy probably taught you those songs?" But it was when she reached toward the collar that everything changed. Her fingers found the edge where the canvas had worn thin, and there, carved deep into the leather backing in Tommy's careful 8-year-old handwriting, were the words that stopped her heart. "If found, please bring Ranger home to Grandma Eleanor's house on Willow Creek Road." The room spun around her like a carnival ride. Tommy had been wearing this collar the day he disappeared, had carved those words the week before as part of a school project about being responsible pet owners. She'd helped him form the letters, guiding his small hand with hers. Sarah, Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible above the thundering of her own pulse. This collar. It belonged to my grandson's dog. Sarah looked up from preparing a syringe, confusion creasing her young face. That's impossible, Eleanor. Tommy's been gone for 5 years. I know exactly how long Tommy's been gone. Eleanor's fingers traced the familiar stitching pattern she'd sewn herself. I made this collar. I watched Tommy carve his name in the leather. And now it's here, on a wolf that's been tortured by the same people who... She couldn't finish the sentence. The implications were too large, too terrifying to voice. Sarah set down her equipment and moved closer, her expression shifting from confusion to alarm. Eleanor, you're talking about a dog collar. Dogs and wolves aren't... Look at the markings, Eleanor interrupted, her voice growing stronger with each word. Look at the wear pattern. This collar's been on a living animal for years, Sarah. And if it's been on this wolf, then someone put it there. Someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The phone rang in the house, shrill and insistent. Eleanor ignored it. It rang again, then stopped, then started again with the persistence of bad news that wouldn't wait. Through the barn window, Eleanor could see a black sedan parked across the road, not moving, just sitting there with its engine running and its windows too dark to see through. The same car had been following her since she left the auction, maintaining a careful distance but never quite disappearing. As if reading her thoughts, the young wolf struggled to lift his head, amber eyes focusing on the window with an intelligence that seemed almost human. His lips pulled back from his teeth, not in aggression but in recognition. He'd seen that car before. Eleanor's blood turned to ice water in her veins. If Tommy's collar was here, and if someone was watching her now, then her grandson's death had been no accident at all. The first week after bringing the wolves home passed like a fever dream, filled with sleepless nights and small victories that felt monumental in Eleanor's hollow world. She'd named them instinctively. Hope for the female, whose amber eyes held a fierce maternal protectiveness despite her broken body. Faith for the male, who somehow maintained dignity even in chains. And Tommy for the young one wearing her grandson's collar, though she couldn't bring herself to say that name aloud yet. Dr. Sarah Mitchell visited twice daily, her initial skepticism giving way to grudging admiration as the wolves responded to Eleanor's care with remarkable progress. The old nursing instincts came flooding back. How to read pain in a creature's eyes, when to push through resistance and when to wait. The delicate balance between medicine and simple human kindness that separated good caregivers from great ones. But it was the collar that consumed Eleanor's thoughts during the long hours she spent in the barn. She'd examined every inch of the faded canvas, traced every stitch with trembling fingers, and there was no doubt. This was the collar she'd made for Ranger 3 years before Tommy disappeared. The question that kept her awake at night was simpler and more terrifying than she wanted to acknowledge. How had it gotten from a dead dog onto a tortured wolf? On the 4th night, while she dozed in the old rocking chair beside the wolf enclosures, the phone rang. Eleanor's eyes snapped open, her heart hammering as she glanced at the kitchen clock. 2:47 a.m. Nobody called with good news at that hour. The voice on the other end was mechanically distorted, like someone speaking through a device designed to hide their identity. You made a mistake at the auction, Mrs. Thompson. Some things are better left buried. The line went dead before Eleanor could respond. She stood at the kitchen window, cordless phone still clutched in her white-knuckled grip, and studied the darkness beyond her property line. The black sedan had been there for 3 days now, parking in different spots along Willow Creek Road, but never quite disappearing entirely. During daylight hours, she'd catch glimpses of figures with binoculars, too distant to make out faces but close enough to send ice through her veins. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. Jeremiah Blackwood arrived just after sunrise, climbing out of a dust-covered pickup truck with Tennessee plates. Up close, he looked different than he had at the auction. Tired, haunted, with the hollow-eyed expression of a man who'd lost everything that mattered and was still pretending to be whole. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, removing his hat with old-fashioned courtesy that seemed genuine. "I've come to discuss a business proposition." Eleanor met him on the front porch, close enough to the barn that she could hear if the wolves became agitated. "If you're here to buy them back, you're wasting your time and mine." "Actually, ma'am, I'm here to warn you." Blackwood's voice carried none of the showman's bluster she remembered from the auction. "Those animals you bought, they're not just wolves. They're evidence of something bigger and more dangerous than either of us understood." He pulled a photograph from his shirt pocket, a school picture of a boy about 10 years old with sandy hair and freckles across his nose. "This is my son Marcus. He disappeared 4 years ago while camping with his scout troop up in the Smoky Mountains. Official reports said bear attack, but they never found remains, just like they never found your grandson's body." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying there's a reason those wolves ended up at that auction, and a reason you were there to bid on them. Someone wanted us to find each other, Mrs. Thompson. Someone who's been watching both our families for a very long time." That afternoon, while Sarah tended to the wolves' medical needs, Eleanor made a decision that would have seemed impossible a week earlier. She drove to the Millbrook County Sheriff's Department and asked to speak with Bob Wilson, who'd retired 2 years after Tommy's disappearance, but still lived in town. Bob looked older than his 68 years, retirement having settled on his shoulders like a heavy coat. But his eyes still held the sharp intelligence that had made him a good lawman for 37 years. "Eleanor," he said, gesturing to a chair in his small apartment above Henderson's feed store. "I wondered when you'd come to see me. You had doubts about Tommy's case, didn't you?" Bob was quiet for a long moment, studying his weathered hands. "I had a lot of doubts. Flash flood was possible, sure enough, but the timing never sat right with me. Creek was running low that week, had been all summer. And then there was the matter of his shoes." "His shoes?" "Found them neat and tidy on the creek bank, like someone had placed them there intentional-like. In my experience, kids who fall in rushing water don't stop to take off their shoes first." Bob's jaw tightened. "I pushed for a wider investigation, but the state boys said we didn't have enough evidence to justify the expense. Case got closed, and I was told to focus on crimes we could actually solve." Eleanor felt the familiar burn of hope and fury mixing in her chest. "Bob, I need to know, were there other children who went missing around that time? Kids whose cases got written off as accidents or runaways?" Bob's expression grew grim. "3 that I know of, spread out over 18 months so nobody saw the pattern. Marcus Blackwood was the last one. After that, whoever was taking them got smart and moved on to other counties." The pieces were starting to form a picture that made Eleanor's stomach turn. Someone's been kidnapping children and using them to train animals for fighting rings. That's what I suspected, but suspicion don't make a case without evidence. Bob leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Eleanor, I'm going to tell you something that could get us both killed if the wrong people find out. 3 months before Tommy disappeared, I got a tip about illegal animal fighting happening up in the National Forest. When I went to investigate, I found fresh tire tracks and evidence of cages, but whoever was running the operation had cleared out hours before I arrived. Someone warned them you were coming. Someone with access to police communications, someone who knew exactly when and where I'd be looking." Bob's eyes met hers with the weight of years of frustration and guilt. "I think Tommy stumbled across something he wasn't supposed to see, and they took him to keep him quiet." Eleanor's hands were shaking as she drove home through the gathering dusk. The black sedan followed at a discreet distance, no longer bothering to hide its presence. When she turned into her driveway, it continued past, but she knew it would be back. The wolves were restless that evening, pacing their enclosure with an energy they hadn't shown since their arrival. Tommy, she'd finally started using the name, if only in her thoughts, kept positioning himself near the barn's rear exit, head cocked as if listening to sounds only he could hear. At midnight, those sounds became audible to human ears. Voices, low and urgent, coming from the woods behind her property. Eleanor slipped out the kitchen door and made her way to the barn, staying low and moving with the careful quiet her father had taught her during childhood games of hide-and-seek that seemed a lifetime ago. Through a gap in the barn siding, she could see lights moving between the trees, flashlights in the hands of men who were trying to stay hidden, but not trying hard enough. They were discussing her, she realized with growing dread, planning something that involved the wolves and the old woman who's asking too many questions. Tommy's low growl alerted her to movement closer to the barn. A figure in dark clothing was approaching the rear entrance, something metallic glinting in his hand. Eleanor's blood turned to ice as she recognized the shape, a tranquilizer gun, the kind used by wildlife officers to subdue dangerous animals. She had perhaps 30 seconds before they discovered the locks she'd added to the wolf enclosures. Another minute before they figured out how to break them. Not enough time to call for help, barely enough time to think. But sometimes thinking wasn't what the situation required. Sometimes survival came down to the lessons learned during 40 years of emergency nursing: stay calm, assess the threat, and act decisively when lives hung in the balance. Eleanor slipped back to the house and retrieved Henry's old hunting rifle from the bedroom closet, along with the box of ammunition she'd never expected to need. Her hands were steady as she loaded the weapon, muscle memory from childhood hunting trips with her father guiding her movements. When she returned to the barn, the intruders had already breached the rear entrance. 3 men in tactical gear moving with military precision toward the wolf enclosures. The one in front was raising his tranquilizer gun toward Tommy when Eleanor's voice cut through the darkness. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." The men spun toward her voice, and Eleanor saw their faces clearly for the first time. Young, hard, with the blank expressions of people who'd learned to follow orders without asking questions, the kind of men who could steal children and torture animals and sleep peacefully afterward. "Ma'am, you need to step away from the rifle," the leader said, his voice carrying the false calm of someone trained in hostage negotiation. "We're here on official business." "Whose official business would that be?" Eleanor kept the rifle trained on center mass, just like her father had taught her. "Because Sheriff Wilson never mentioned sending anyone to collect evidence from my property." The man's hesitation told her everything she needed to know. These weren't law enforcement officers. They were cleanup crew, sent to eliminate loose ends that threatened something much larger than a simple animal fighting ring. Behind the men, she could see Tommy watching through the bars of his enclosure, amber eyes reflecting the faint light with an intelligence that seemed almost human. He wasn't just observing, he was learning, cataloging these faces the same way he'd probably cataloged the faces of every person who'd hurt him over the past 5 years. If Tommy was still alive, if he was somewhere out there waiting for rescue, then these men knew where to find him. Eleanor's finger moved to the rifle's trigger, and her voice carried all the authority of a woman who'd spent decades making life-and-death decisions under pressure. "Gentlemen, I believe it's time you and I had a conversation about missing children." The standoff in Eleanor's barn stretched into what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the kind of suspended time that happens when life balances on the edge of a knife. The 3 intruders had spread out in a practiced formation, but Eleanor's position near the barn's main entrance gave her the advantage of cover and a clear line of retreat if things went sideways. "Ma'am," the leader said again, his voice still carrying that false calm, "we're going to need you to lower that weapon. Nobody wants anyone to get hurt here." Eleanor's laugh came out harsh and bitter. Nobody wanted Tommy to get hurt either, but that didn't stop you people from taking him, did it?" The slight widening of the man's eyes told her she'd hit the mark. Behind him, his companions exchanged glances that confirmed what Bob Wilson had suspected for 5 years. Tommy's disappearance was no accident, and these men knew exactly what had happened to him. "I don't know what you're talking about, lady." "We're here about the wolves. The wolves that just happened to be wearing my grandson's dog collar? The wolves that someone tortured for years to break their spirits before putting them up for auction?" Eleanor's voice grew stronger with each word, righteous anger burning away the fear that had paralyzed her for so long. "I may be old, boys, but I wasn't born yesterday." That's when Tommy, the young wolf, did something that changed everything. He began to howl, a low, mournful sound that seemed to carry the pain of every child who'd ever been stolen from their family. But there was something else in that howl, something that made the hair on Eleanor's arms stand up. It wasn't random animal distress. It was a pattern, a rhythm that sounded almost like, "Help! Help! Help!" Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. The wolf was trying to communicate, forming sounds that approximated human speech with the desperate intelligence of a creature that had learned language from a child's voice, a child who'd spent years teaching him words through the bars of a cage. The intruders heard it too. The leader's professional composure cracked for just an instant, and in that moment of distraction, Eleanor made her move. "Sarah!" she screamed toward the house, hoping the veterinarian was still there, still awake. "Call Sheriff Wilson. Tell him to bring backup." The barn exploded into chaos. The intruders lunged for cover as Eleanor fired a warning shot into the rafters, the rifle's boom echoing like thunder in the confined space. Wood splinters rained down as the men scrambled for position, their own weapons appearing with practiced speed. But they'd made a crucial mistake. They'd underestimated the wolves. Hope and Faith had been watching, learning, waiting for their moment. As the men dove for cover, the adult wolves began working on the hastily repaired locks of their enclosures with the focused determination of creatures who'd spent years planning their escape. Hope's powerful jaws found the weak point in the chain link where Sarah had patched a hole, while Faith used his greater bulk to push against the gate's hinges. The sound of metal bending and snapping cut through the gunfire, and suddenly the barn was full of moving shadows. Not 3 wolves, but 5. 2 more had emerged from the darkness outside, drawn by Tommy's distress calls. Wild wolves, lean and dangerous, with none of the broken spirit of their captive cousins. Eleanor realized with crystal clarity that the rescued wolves had been calling to their pack, and the pack had answered. "Jesus Christ!" one of the intruders screamed, his military training crumbling in the face of an enemy he'd never been taught to fight. "They're everywhere!" Eleanor used the confusion to her advantage, moving deeper into the barn where Henry's old workbench provided better cover. From there she could see the incredible sight unfolding before her. 5 wolves working in perfect coordination to herd the armed men into a corner, cutting off their escape routes with the tactical precision of creatures born to hunt in packs. The leader tried to raise his tranquilizer gun toward Tommy, and that's when hope struck. The female wolf launched herself through the air with speed that seemed impossible for an animal that had been near death a week earlier, her jaws clamping down on the man's wrist with bone-crushing force. The weapon clattered to the barn floor as he screamed in pain and terror. "Stand down! All of you, stand down!" The voice that cut through the chaos was deep and authoritative, belonging to someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Eleanor turned to see a tall man in an expensive suit standing in the barn's doorway, flanked by 2 more figures in tactical gear. But these newcomers weren't pointing their weapons at Eleanor or the wolves. They were aiming at the 3 intruders, who were now huddled against the far wall with wild wolves circling them like sharks scenting blood. FBI, the tall man announced, pulling out credentials. Agent David Nash, Organized Crime Task Force. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to call off your friends there before they do something we'll all regret. Eleanor stared at him in confusion. Call them off? I'm not the one they're listening to. Agent Nash followed her gaze to Tommy, who was sitting calmly in the center of the barn, no longer howling but watching the proceedings with those unnervingly intelligent amber eyes. The young wolf looked from Eleanor to the agent, then back to Eleanor, as if waiting for her to make a decision about whether these new arrivals were friends or enemies. Down, Eleanor said softly, using the same tone she'd used with Ranger years ago. Down, boy. It's okay. To her amazement, Tommy responded immediately, lying down but remaining alert. The other wolves followed his lead, though they kept their positions around the trapped intruders. Mrs. Thompson, Agent Nash said, holstering his weapon, we've been investigating an interstate child trafficking operation for the past 3 years. These men work for an organization that specializes in kidnapping children and using them to train animals for illegal fighting rings. The children form emotional bonds with the animals, making them more effective trainers, and the psychological trauma makes them less likely to attempt escape. The words hit Eleanor like physical blows. You're saying Tommy's alive? We believe so, yes, ma'am. Along with at least 12 other children taken over the past decade, the operation moves frequently, but we've tracked them to a compound in the Appalachian Mountains, about 200 miles from here. Eleanor's legs gave out, and she sank onto an overturned feed bucket, the rifle sliding from nerveless fingers. After 5 years of grief, 5 years of believing her grandson was dead, the possibility that he might be alive was almost too much to process. Why didn't you contact me sooner? Because until yesterday, we didn't know you were connected to one of the victims, the wolves you bought at auction. They were part of an evidence transfer gone wrong. Someone in our task force leaked information about a planned raid, and the trafficking organization decided to liquidate their assets rather than risk exposure. Agent Nash gestured toward Tommy, who was now sitting beside Eleanor's feet like a loyal dog. This animal has been with your grandson for over 4 years. He's the closest thing we have to a witness, and the bond between them may be the key to locating the other children before the organization relocates again. One of the captured intruders, the leader who'd first tried to negotiate with Eleanor, laughed bitterly from his position on the floor. You have no idea what you're dealing with, old woman. The people we work for don't leave loose ends. They'll burn down half of Tennessee to tie up this mess, starting with you and that animal. Hope growled low in her throat, her lips pulling back from teeth that could crush bone like kindling. The man fell silent. He's not wrong about the danger, Agent Nash admitted. The organization we're dealing with has connections in law enforcement, local government, even the federal system. That's why this operation has been so difficult to penetrate. Eleanor looked down at Tommy, at the intelligent eyes that seemed to hold so much pain and knowledge. What do you need from me? We need you to trust us, and we need you to let that wolf guide us to where the children are being held. He's been there, Mrs. Thompson. He knows the way home. The word home hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that made Eleanor's heart race. Home wasn't just a place. It was where family waited, where love survived despite impossible circumstances, where a grandmother's hope had kept a light burning in the darkness for 5 long years. Tommy whined softly and pressed his muzzle against Eleanor's hand, and she felt something pass between them, recognition, trust, and the kind of bond that transcends species. This wolf had protected her grandson when she couldn't, had kept him alive through horrors she could barely imagine. When do we leave? She asked, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her cheeks. Agent Nash smiled for the first time since entering the barn. First light, ma'am. First light. Outside, dawn was already beginning to touch the eastern horizon, painting the sky the color of hope renewed. Eleanor Thompson, who'd spent 5 years learning to live with loss, was about to discover that sometimes the impossible was just another word for miracle waiting to happen. The rescue mission launched at dawn with the desperate precision of people who knew they had one chance to get everything right. Agent Nash's team had tracked the trafficking organization to an abandoned mining compound deep in the Cherokee National Forest, a facility that had been officially closed for 15 years, but showed recent signs of habitation, generator-powered electricity, fresh tire tracks, and the kind of security measures that suggested whoever was using it valued privacy above all else. Eleanor rode in the lead vehicle with Tommy pressed against her side, the wolf's body tense with recognition as they wound through mountain roads that grew progressively narrower and more isolated. The animal's behavior had been changing since they left Millbrook. Less of the calm domesticity he'd shown at the farm, more of the alert wariness of a creature returning to a place of trauma. "He knows where we're going," Eleanor murmured to Agent Nash, watching Tommy's ears swivel toward sounds only he could detect. "Look at his eyes. He's remembering." The FBI agent checked his radio for the third time in 10 minutes, his jaw tight with the kind of tension that came from operations where too many variables remained unknown. "Mrs. Thompson, I need you to understand what we might find up there. These children have been held for years in conditions designed to break their spirits. They may not react the way you expect, even to rescue." Eleanor's hand found the worn leather of her purse, where Tommy's school photo had lived for 5 years, creased from handling, faded from tears, but still showing the gap-toothed smile of a boy who'd believed the world was fundamentally good. "Agent Nash, I've spent 40 years as a nurse. I've seen what trauma does to children. I also know that love has a way of reaching through the darkest places, even when everything else fails." 2 miles from the target, the convoy stopped. Tommy began to whine, a sound that started low and built to something that made Eleanor's heart clench with recognition. It was the same sound he'd made in the barn when the intruders appeared, not random distress, but communication, warning. "They know we're coming," she said, though she couldn't explain how she was certain. Agent Nash was already on his radio, coordinating with surveillance teams positioned around the compound's perimeter. The response came back in terse, professional language that couldn't quite hide the fear. Visual confirmation of at least 20 armed subjects. Multiple buildings showing thermal signatures consistent with large numbers of people. Possible booby traps detected along all approach routes. The original plan called for a coordinated assault at first light, but the organization had clearly been preparing for this moment. What should have been a surprise rescue was turning into a siege, with unknown numbers of children caught in the middle. "We need to abort," Nash's second-in-command advised through the radio static. "Fall back and call in additional resources. This is bigger than we anticipated." But Eleanor was watching Tommy, seeing something in the wolf's posture that made her think of the way he'd positioned himself in the barn, not cowering from danger, but preparing to face it with the kind of courage that came from protecting someone you loved. "Agent Nash," she said quietly, "what if we're approaching this wrong? What if, instead of trying to break in, we let them know we're here? Let them know that someone's finally come for these children?" "Ma'am, with respect, that would be suicide. These people have killed to protect their operation." Eleanor's eyes met Tommy's amber gaze, and she saw something that made her breath catch. Intelligence, yes, but also determination. This wolf had spent 4 years protecting her grandson, keeping him alive through circumstances she could barely imagine. He wasn't afraid of the compound. He was eager to return, to complete a mission he'd never been able to finish. "Tommy knows another way in," she said with sudden certainty. "Don't you, boy? You know how to get to the children without going through the guards." The wolf's response was immediate and unmistakable. He moved to the vehicle's door, pawing at the handle with focused intent, then looked back at Eleanor with an expression that seemed to say, "Finally, you understand." What followed was the most terrifying and hopeful hour of Eleanor Thompson's life. Against every protocol and professional recommendation, Agent Nash authorized a limited reconnaissance mission. Eleanor and 2 federal agents following Tommy through terrain that would have challenged experienced hunters, relying on a traumatized wolf's memory to guide them to children who'd been written off as dead years ago. Tommy moved through the forest with increasing confidence, following paths that were invisible to human eyes but clearly marked in his memory. Stream beds that provided cover from observation points, rock formations that shielded them from motion sensors, game trails that wound between the compound's outer defenses like a maze designed by someone who understood both human security and animal behavior. They were within 50 yards of the main building when Eleanor heard the sound that stopped her heart. Children's voices, weak and frightened, calling to each other across what sounded like a considerable distance. Not crying, but communicating in the kind of coded language that prisoners develop when they need to share information without alerting their captors. "8 of us left," one voice said, probably a girl in her early teens. "Marcus says the new people might not be friendlies." "Tommy's wolf came back," another voice responded, younger, male. "That means someone's looking for us." Eleanor's legs nearly gave out. Tommy, her Tommy, was alive, was in that building, was still hoping someone would come for him after 5 years of captivity, but it was what happened next that shattered her completely. Tommy the wolf began to howl, the same pattern Eleanor had heard in the barn, but clearer now, more complex, a song of longing and loyalty and promises kept despite impossible circumstances. And from inside the building came an answering howl, human voice trying to match animal sounds, a boy who'd learned to speak wolf because it was the only way to communicate with his protector. "Grandma?" The word came faintly through the compound's walls, disbelieving but desperate. "Grandma Eleanor?" Agent Nash was already coordinating the final assault, his team moving into position with the precision of people who understood that failure meant watching children die. But Eleanor was focused on something else. The sound of her grandson's voice, older and rougher than she remembered, but unmistakably the boy she'd lost 5 years ago. Tommy wasn't just alive. He was still her Tommy, still the child who believed his grandmother would never stop looking for him, never stop fighting to bring him home. The compound's security systems began to fail in sequence as the FBI's technical team disabled them one by one. Emergency lights flickered and died. Electronic locks clicked open. And in the sudden silence that followed, Eleanor heard something that would haunt her dreams for the rest of her life. The sound of children sobbing with relief, finally believing that rescue was real. But rescue was only the beginning. What they found inside the compound would change everything Eleanor thought she knew about evil, about survival, and about the lengths desperate people would go to protect the ones they loved. What Eleanor found inside the compound shattered every assumption she'd made about her grandson's captivity and forced her to confront truths more devastating than his death would have been. The children were alive, 8 of them ranging in age from 10 to 17, huddled in a communal room that had once been the mining facility's break area. But they weren't victims in the way Eleanor had imagined. They moved with the careful coordination of a pack, positioning themselves protectively around the younger ones, communicating through glances and gestures that spoke of years spent learning to survive together. Tommy stood among them, no longer the 8-year-old boy who'd disappeared from her woods 5 years ago. At 13, he was lean and wary, with old eyes and a young face and scars on his hands that told stories Eleanor didn't want to imagine. When he saw her, his expression cycled through disbelief, hope, and something that looked disturbingly like fear. Grandma? His voice cracked on the word as if he'd forgotten how to say it. You're really here? Eleanor took a step toward him, then stopped as every child in the room tensed. They weren't afraid of her. They were afraid for Tommy, ready to defend him against any threat, including the grandmother who'd spent 5 years grieving him. It's okay, Tommy said quickly, his voice carrying an authority that no 13-year-old should possess. She's safe. This is my grandma Eleanor. She's the one who taught me about wolves. The revelation of what the children had endured came in fragments over the next hour, pieced together from Agent Nash's interrogation of the captured traffickers and the halting testimony of kids who'd learned to speak carefully about their experiences. The trafficking organization didn't just use children to train fighting animals. They developed a systematic approach to breaking family bonds and rebuilding them around survival. Children were told their families had given up looking for them, that they'd been sold because they were unwanted burdens. They were given new names, new identities, and gradually conditioned to see their captors as providers rather than oppressors. Those who showed aptitude for animal training were rewarded with better food, warmer sleeping quarters, and the companionship of the creatures they cared for. Tommy had been exceptional at the work. He saved all of us, Marcus Blackwood whispered to Eleanor while Tommy spoke with Agent Nash. At 15, Marcus was the oldest of the captive children and clearly their leader. When new kids came in, Tommy would take the worst assignments, work with the most dangerous animals so the little ones wouldn't have to. He told us stories about you, about the farm, about how wolves take care of their pack. That's how we survived, by being a pack like the animals. But survival had come at a price that made Eleanor's heart break in ways she hadn't known were possible. Tommy spoke about wolves with the expertise of a professional trainer, could read animal behavior with uncanny accuracy, and moved through the world with the hypervigilance of someone who'd learned that danger could come from any direction at any moment. He was also terrified of leaving. "What if you decide you don't want me anymore?" he asked Eleanor during a quiet moment while the FBI processed the crime scene. They sat together on a wooden crate outside the compound's main building, Tommy close enough to touch but still maintaining the careful distance of someone who'd learned not to trust comfort. "I'm not the same kid who left your house, Grandma. I've done things. I've seen things." Eleanor's throat closed around words that felt inadequate to the moment. How do you tell a child that love doesn't have conditions? That family isn't something you can lose through trauma or time or the terrible things survival requires? "Tommy," she said finally, "do you remember when Ranger got hurt by that barbed wire fence? How we took care of him even though he bit us when we tried to clean his wounds?" Tommy nodded, the first genuine smile she'd seen crossing his face. "You said, hurt animals bite because they're scared, not because they're mean." "That's right. And you know what else I said? That we don't throw away family just because they're hurt." Eleanor reached out slowly, giving him time to pull away, and touched his scarred hand with fingers that trembled with 5 years of restrained hope. "You're my grandson, Tommy Thompson. That doesn't change because you're hurt or scared or different than you were before. That doesn't change because you've survived things I couldn't protect you from." But even as they sat together in the mountain sunlight, Eleanor could see the other children watching them with expressions that mixed hope and envy and loss. Marcus had no family left. His parents had died in a car accident while he was missing, never knowing their son was alive. 3 of the younger children had been taken so long ago they could barely remember their original names. The logistics of reunion proved more complex than rescue. The children had been isolated from normal society for years, had missed critical developmental milestones, and carried trauma that would require specialized care. They needed medical attention, psychological evaluation, and careful reintroduction to families who might no longer exist or might not know how to handle what their children had become. Doctor. Sarah Mitchell arrived by helicopter that afternoon, her veterinary bag supplemented by medical supplies for human patients. Her examination of the children revealed malnutrition, untreated injuries, and signs of systematic abuse, but also remarkable resilience and adaptation. They'd taken care of each other with the kind of fierce loyalty that trauma sometimes creates, and separating them would be another form of cruelty. "They're not going to fit easily back into normal life," Sarah told Eleanor privately. "These kids have learned to survive in ways that most people can't understand. Tommy especially. He's been their protector for years. Taking him away from them is going to feel like abandonment all over again." The compound held evidence of horrors that would fuel federal prosecutions for years. Financial records showing the trafficking network's scope, video documentation of animal fights, and correspondence revealing corruption that reached into state and federal law enforcement. But it also held something else that broke Eleanor's heart: a makeshift memorial to the animals and children who hadn't survived. Tommy had built it in a corner of the old mining office, using stones and wildflowers and small personal items to mark the memory of friends who'd died protecting each other. 12 crosses for children, 37 for animals, each one carefully tended and decorated with the kind of loving attention that spoke of grief too large for a young mind to process alone. "I tried to keep everyone safe," Tommy said when he found Eleanor kneeling beside the memorial. "But I couldn't save them all. Some of the little kids got sick and we didn't have medicine. Some of the animals fought back too hard and they got put down. I should have done more, should have been stronger." Eleanor pulled him into her arms then, feeling how his 13-year-old body still fit against her shoulder, still carried the muscle memory of childhood comfort even after everything he'd endured. "Baby boy, you did everything you could. You kept yourself alive, and you kept these other children alive, and that's more than anyone should have asked of you." But Tommy's tears weren't just for the dead. They were for the living, for the family he'd built among the other captives and was now being asked to leave behind. For 5 years, these children had been his responsibility, his purpose, his reason to survive another day. Returning to normal life meant abandoning them, and abandonment was the deepest wound any of them carried. Agent Nash found them there as the sun was setting, his expression carrying news that would change everything again. "Mrs. Thompson, we've got a problem. The organization's leadership structure is larger than we thought, and they've got resources we didn't anticipate. Word of this raid has already reached their other facilities, and they're moving to eliminate evidence." "What kind of evidence?" Nash's jaw tightened. "Other children, ma'am. We estimate at least 50 more kids in facilities across 4 states, and they're all in immediate danger now that we've compromised this location." Eleanor looked at Tommy, at the determined set of his young shoulders as he processed what he'd just heard. Other children, alone and scared, facing the same horrors he'd survived. Other families like hers living with grief and false hope and the terrible uncertainty of not knowing. "What do you need us to do?" Tommy asked, his voice carrying none of the hesitation he'd shown about leaving with Eleanor. When it came to protecting other kids, there was no question in his mind about what came next. Agent Nash looked uncomfortable. "Son, you've done more than enough. It's time to let the adults handle this." But Eleanor saw something in her grandson's eyes that reminded her of herself at the auction, facing down a room full of people who thought she was crazy for caring about 3 dying wolves. Sometimes the right thing to do was also the impossible thing, and sometimes children understood truths that adults had forgotten. "Agent Nash," she said quietly, "I think Tommy's trying to tell you that this isn't over. Not for him, not for these other children, and not for us." The compound fell silent, except for the sound of wind through the trees and the distant rumble of vehicles carrying evidence and testimony toward justice that might be years in coming. But Eleanor Thompson, who'd spent 5 years learning that love was stronger than loss, was beginning to understand that rescue was just the beginning of the real work. Her grandson was alive, but he was also forever changed. The other children needed more help than the system was prepared to give. And somewhere out there, 50 more families were living with the same grief she'd carried, not knowing that hope was still possible if someone was brave enough to fight for it. Tommy's hand found hers in the gathering darkness, no longer the soft palm of the 8-year-old she remembered, but calloused and strong from years of caring for creatures that couldn't care for themselves. "Grandma," he said, "I think we've got more work to do." 6 months later, Eleanor Thompson stood in the main room of what had once been her quiet farmhouse and marveled at how completely her life had transformed. The living room buzzed with controlled chaos. 3 teenagers hunched over laptops coordinating with FBI task forces across 4 states. A 14-year-old girl teaching basic first aid to 2 younger boys. And Tommy curled up on the couch with Faith pressed against his side, both of them monitoring police scanner traffic for signs of new trafficking operations. The Willow Creek Safe Haven, as the media had dubbed it, had become something Eleanor never planned, but couldn't imagine living without. When the state child welfare system proved inadequate to handle 8 severely traumatized children with specialized needs, and when Tommy refused to be separated from the makeshift family that had kept him alive for 5 years, Eleanor had made a decision that scandalized some neighbors and inspired others. She'd officially fostered all 8 children. The logistics had been staggering, converting the old dairy barn into dormitory-style housing, hiring specialized therapists who understood complex trauma, navigating legal battles with bureaucrats who insisted the children belonged in separate facilities designed for proper rehabilitation. Eleanor had spent the last of Henry's life insurance settlement, taken out a second mortgage on the farm, and called in favors from every contact she'd made during 40 years of nursing. But it had worked. Marcus Blackwood, now 16 and the unofficial leader among the older children, had gained 30 pounds and lost the hyper-vigilant wariness that had marked his first months of freedom. He'd also discovered a gift for organizing rescue operations, coordinating with law enforcement agencies to locate other trafficking facilities with the inside knowledge only a survivor could provide. "Grandma Eleanor," Marcus called from his laptop station, "we've got confirmation on the Georgia facility. Local FBI is moving in at dawn, and they're requesting Tommy's input on the animal handling protocols." Tommy looked up from the police scanner, his expression cycling through the careful assessment Eleanor had learned to recognize. At 14, he possessed expertise that law enforcement agencies were still learning to value, the ability to read animal behavior in traumatic situations, to understand how captive children bonded with their animal companions, and to predict how both would react during rescue operations. "How many kids?" Tommy asked, already reaching for the satellite phone Agent Nash had given him for these situations. "Preliminary count suggests 12 children, ages 7 to 15. Unknown number of animals, but thermal imaging shows large concentrations in the facility's basement level." Eleanor watched Tommy's face harden with the kind of determination that still broke her heart. Her grandson had found purpose in his trauma, channeling his survival skills into saving others, but the weight of that responsibility aged him in ways that no 14-year-old should carry. "I'll need to leave tonight," Tommy said, his tone matter-of-fact. "If they're keeping animals in basement facilities, the rescue teams will need to understand pack dynamics before they breach. One wrong move, and the kids will try to protect the animals, even from their rescuers." This was the new normal. Tommy traveling with FBI units as a specialized consultant, using knowledge purchased with 5 years of his childhood to prevent other children from facing the same horrors. Eleanor was proud of him and terrified for him in equal measure. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, who'd become the Safe Haven's unofficial medical director, looked up from her examination of Luna's healing leg wound. "Tommy, you've been on 3 operations in the past month. Maybe it's time to let the adults handle this one." Tommy's response was gentle but implacable. Dr. Mitchell, those kids down there don't trust adults. They trust animals, and they trust other kids who understand what they've been through. You can't rescue them the same way you'd rescue normal children because they're not normal children anymore." The truth of that statement hung heavy in the room. None of the Willow Creek children were normal by conventional standards. They woke screaming from nightmares, hoarded food despite having plenty, and formed protective huddles whenever strangers approached. But they also demonstrated resilience and loyalty that humbled the adults caring for them. 10-year-old Sarah, not her original name, but the only one she remembered, had learned to perform basic veterinary procedures on injured animals. 13-year-old David could track movement through terrain that challenged experienced hunters. 11-year-old Maria spoke 4 languages she'd learned from other captive children, making her invaluable for communicating with recent rescues who didn't speak English. They were children shaped by trauma into something unprecedented, and the world was still learning how to help them heal while honoring what they'd become. Eleanor's phone rang, displaying Agent Nash's number. The conversation was brief, but loaded with implications that made her stomach clench with familiar dread. "What is it, Grandma?" Tommy asked, reading her expression with the accuracy that came from years of survival depending on interpreting adult moods. "Agent Nash says there's been a development in the investigation. The trafficking network was larger than they initially believed, and some of the leadership escaped during the raids. There's evidence they're rebuilding in Mexico, possibly planning retaliation against the families of rescued children." The room fell silent except for the sound of Faith's low whine, not distress, but recognition. The wolf had learned to sense tension in human voices, responding to emotional cues with the same intensity he'd once reserved for physical threats. Marcus closed his laptop with deliberate care. "What kind of retaliation?" Eleanor hesitated, knowing that sharing this information would change everything for children who'd just begun to feel safe. But they deserved the truth. They'd survived this long by understanding exactly what they were facing. Kidnapping family members, targeting the people who rescued them. The kind of psychological warfare designed to make survivors wish they'd never been found. Tommy stood with movements that reminded Eleanor disturbingly of his father. Her son who'd died in Afghanistan before he could watch his boy grow up. That same set to the shoulders, the same willingness to face danger that should have been someone else's responsibility. "They're not coming for us," Tommy said with quiet certainty. "They're coming for you, for Dr. Mitchell, for Agent Nash, for everyone who helped us." Eleanor felt the familiar weight of decisions that carried life and death consequences. She'd spent 6 months building something beautiful and fragile, a place where traumatized children could heal while maintaining the bonds that had kept them alive. Now that sanctuary was threatened by forces that saw love as weakness and family as leverage. But she'd also spent 6 months watching these children demonstrate courage that put most adults to shame. They'd testified in federal court despite their terror of authority figures. They'd shared their trauma with therapists and investigators and journalists, knowing that their stories might prevent other children from facing the same horrors. They'd built something together that transcended the categories of victim and survivor, creating a new kind of family based on choice rather than blood. "Tommy," Eleanor said carefully, "what are you thinking?" Her grandson looked at her with eyes that held too much knowledge for his age, but also held something else. Hope tempered by experience, love deepened by loss, and the kind of fierce determination that had kept him alive when death would have been easier. "I'm thinking we don't run. I'm thinking we don't hide. And I'm thinking these people made a mistake when they decided to threaten our family." Marcus nodded slowly, his fingers already moving toward his laptop. "The network's weakness has always been their assumption that children are powerless. But we're not children anymore, not in the ways that matter. We're survivors, and survivors fight back." Eleanor looked around the room at faces that had aged decades in the past 6 months, at children who'd learned to weaponize their trauma in service of protecting others. Part of her wanted to bundle them all into cars and flee to some place where the past couldn't find them. But a larger part, the part that had bid $300 on dying wolves because she couldn't stand to see suffering ignored, knew that running would be another form of defeat. "Dr. Mitchell," Eleanor said, her voice carrying the authority she'd learned in 40 years of emergency nursing. "I need you to contact your veterinary college friends. We're going to need medical support for an extended operation." Sarah looked up from Luna's bandages, understanding immediately. "Eleanor, you're talking about turning a children's sanctuary into a fortress." "I'm talking about protecting our family the same way they protected each other for 5 years, by being smarter, stronger, and more determined than the people who want to destroy us." Tommy moved to stand beside her, his hand finding hers with the same trust he'd shown as an 8-year-old boy who believed his grandmother could solve any problem. But now that trust was tempered with knowledge of what victory required and what defeat would cost. "Grandma," he said quietly, "are you sure about this? Because once we start fighting back, there's no going back to being normal people living normal lives." Eleanor Thompson, who'd spent 5 years grieving a grandson who was alive, who'd mortgaged her future to save children the system couldn't handle, who'd turned her quiet farmhouse into a beacon for the broken and lost, looked at the family she'd chosen and the family that had chosen her. "Tommy," she said with a smile that held all the love and fear and determination of a woman who'd learned that sometimes the most important battles were the ones decent people weren't supposed to fight. "We stopped being normal the day I said I'd take them all." Outside, storm clouds were gathering over the Tennessee mountains, promising the kind of weather that tested everyone's resolve. But inside the Willow Creek safe haven, 8 children and 1 stubborn grandmother were preparing to prove that some bonds were stronger than fear, some families were worth any fight, and some loves were powerful enough to transform the world, one rescued soul at a time. The war was far from over, but they'd already won the only victory that truly mattered. They'd found each other, and they were home. Sometimes we think our greatest heartaches have no purpose, that the empty chairs at our dinner tables and the silence in rooms that once echoed with laughter mean our story is over. Eleanor Thompson believed that too, until 3 dying wolves wearing her grandson's collar changed everything. At 72, broke and forgotten by a community that saw her as the crazy, grieving grandmother, she discovered that love doesn't have an expiration date, and family isn't always blood. When the world told her to give up, she said, "I'll take them all," and found her grandson alive after 5 years. But more than that, she found her purpose, creating a sanctuary where broken children could heal together, where trauma became strength, and where one grandmother's stubborn hope saved dozens of lives. Eleanor's story reminds us that it's never too late to matter, never too late to be needed, never too late to build the family you were meant to have. Sometimes our greatest pain becomes our greatest gift to the world, and sometimes the very thing that broke our heart is exactly what qualifies us to heal others. Share your thoughts. Have you ever felt too old to make a difference, only to discover later that your life experience was exactly what someone needed? What impossible situation in your life taught you that love is stronger than loss?